Good morning. It's 8 o'clock in the east. Do you know where your children are? Whoops, I guess I better turn that on. Good morning. It's 8 o'clock in the east. Do you know where your children are? Okay, that seems to be working. All right. Well, I don't seem to have any panelists as early risers today, so I will just begin alone and carry on. So I've been reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Tarst. And this is volume 2. And I'm working with a essay entitled The Return of the Sacred in an Age of Terror. And I have about 5 more pages. So maybe I will get through it this morning. It's nice to see you, however. Let me clear my screen up a little bit so that I can see the YouTube chat. Okay. All right, that should work. Okay, so this is part 4 of this discussion of this particular essay. And this afternoon, we have a session at 2:15 Eastern Time. It's on the absent father effect on daughters, father desire, and father wounds. And for many of us who are part of broken homes, which is what happened in my case, I have 3 daughters, so this will be an interesting session. I have good relationships with my daughters now, who are now all in their 40s, and thank goodness for that. Okay, so I'm going on into this next section about secularists, and I'm reading from the essay, The Return of the Sacred in an Age of Terror by David Tacey. Secularists imagined that spirit had died with the decline of institutional religion. And so what he means by that sentence is that in the modern time, in the 20th century, institutional religion hasn't done very well because of rationality, because too much rational thought, and therefore the rationalists thought there was no need for religion, but they were wrong, because the spirit did not die. And so in a psychological sense, we need to talk about the spirit. And so anyway, I'll read that sentence again. Secularists imagined that spirit had died with the decline of institutional religion. Spirit for them is an absolute idea that had been defeated by science. But as Vatimo argues, spirit was not overcome, but asleep. The secular turn put spirit in a state of suspended animation, and the intelligentsia thought humanity had entered a new world. But this was not the case. Spirit has been comatose, but is now returning. The modern mind has had its spurt of progress and taste of freedom, and now it has to contend with archaic realities in the soul. which cannot be accounted for by secular materialism. And so what he's saying is that science and scientists who said, oh, there's no such thing as God or what have you, they were wrong. And Nietzsche, I guess, was right in the sense that the God that the Christian church and the Jewish temple had been selling for 2,000 years, in the case of the Jews, even longer, maybe 3,500 years, that God was was a puppeteer who pulled our strings and so on up there. But the real God is not up there. The real God is in here and in here. He's in the heart and the psyche. And that part of God never went away. And so what the secularists, the very rational scientists thought in the 20th century was just not right. And Carl Sagan, who many people love for his astronomy, didn't understand this at all. He was a man of logic. And his last book was, about old myths and so on. And he was railing about astrology and so on in his last interview, which you can find here on YouTube. But the reality is that there is something that we have to contend with and understand. And so anyway, as early as the 1950s, Italian philosopher Romano Giardini had made this prescient remark. A prescient remark is a prophecy or a remark that predicts the future. And so here's the quote. Modern man sought for answers within his soul. Enigmatic powers awoke out of the religious spirit. The force of the numinous impinged itself directly upon the human spirit, either from within the spirit or from the world at large. Not only was the numinous beneficent, but also bewildering, even disruptive in its impact. And so, we can look at the logos and all this move to materialism. Of course, our former president is the poster boy of materialism, but I'm going to show you my favorite picture about this, which is this one, where this individual has a 64-foot motor yacht. So you would think he's fairly happy. But the reality of his motor yacht is he named it Never Enough. And the reason is that owning things, materialism, doesn't support the soul. And so you always want a bigger boat, but it doesn't make you any happier when you get that. And so I was, in my case, the first boat I bought in my adulthood was a 17-foot rowboat, basically. And I was more happy with that boat than I was with a motor yacht myself. I had a 27-foot motor yacht, so about not only about 40% the size of this particular one, but it didn't make me any happier than the little rowboat that I had back in other times. And so we see that our former president He's got many things. He's the poster boy for materialism. He's had buildings that have his name on top of it, and he's had three trophy wives, so-called. He's been president of the United States, so everyone bowed and scraped to him. They played Hail to the Chief and all that stuff, but none of that made him happy. And of course, now that he's out of office, he wants to get back into it because it made him happier. It didn't let him feel so empty when he was hearing Hail to the Chief. But now nobody's bowing and scraping, except he does have Secret Service men around, but that's it. And so that's not a very satisfying way to live, and especially for somebody like him. So if you think, back in I'd say from the 70s on, there was this statement, the guy who dies with the most toys wins. Well, that's not true. If you die with the most toys, you're simply dead, just like everybody else. And so if you want to win, you have to win with something that is going to suit your spiritual nature as well. And that is in building up a family, raising children that are meaningful to you, finding meaning in your life, those sorts of things. And a large motor yacht or a big fancy hotel in Mar-a-Lago doesn't get it for you. It doesn't, none of that. You have to be able to find happiness for yourself within yourself. And so, when you have the most things and you die, you're simply dead, just like everybody else. And if you need to know the wisdom of my Turkish playwright friend, who said, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And so what you have to do is you have to find a spiritual aspect to your life. And it doesn't mean a traditional religion, but it means that you need to learn to be creative and that sort of thing. And that's very satisfying. And so, anyway, I'll go on. I don't want to harangue on this too much, but this sense that the sacred can be a destructive force that it has to tear apart the secular fabric is found in philosophy, psychology, and poetry. One of the most powerful accounts of this destructivity is found in the work of the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas in God and Philosophy, where God is imagined as an antagonist who shreds the defensive structures of the ego. And so, when terrorists attacked our Capitol on January the 6th, they thought that they would get some big high and they would be justified because, their fearless leader would be back in the presidency. But what they got was 2 empty chambers of Congress. And when they got into those chambers, they didn't know what to do with them. They had no idea what to do with them. And, the point is that those chambers of Congress are where the spirit of the American way of life is, the United States way of life is housed in those chambers. but they aren't, our way of life isn't those chambers, and it isn't the people either. Even if they had killed people, they wouldn't have achieved um, anything, because our spirit lives, the American spirit lives in a different place. It lives in the hearts and minds of the American people. And so you can't kill that. You can't steal that with force of arms, no matter what. So, but those people didn't know that. And so they got into those chambers and they simply didn't know what to do because they didn't understand that. So some thought Jung odd when he announced in 1929 that the gods have become diseases. But 3 generations later, Derrida felt that the return of the religious was welling up in the collective mind like a tsunami. Religion, said Derrida, is not something we do, but something that is done to us. It arises from the mysterious source that needs to be explained. Using the language of psychoanalysis, Derrida wrote, how can one account for this return of the religious without bringing into play some sort of logic of the unconscious? And so the point is that the religious function comes from the unconscious part of the psyche. And just a moment, I have to admit panelist who will remain anonymous. And so it comes from our heart anyway. And so so we have to understand our unconscious. And when we understand our unconscious, then we know where religion comes from. So at the end of the 19th century, when Nietzsche said God is dead, what he was talking about is the God that had been sold by the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, for going back as much as 3,500 years or 4,000 years. And the way that God was sold was dead. And so men, particularly men of the 19th century, knew that there was no such God up there, but they didn't want to say it. And nobody wanted to say it. It was like whistling by a graveyard. And the issue is that religions help one find a moral base that you can teach your sons and daughters. And if you lose trust in your moral base, then what you get is 2 world wars and a bunch of little wars throughout the 20th century. And so we have to learn to teach our children better that we do actually have a spiritual aspect to ourselves. It resides in the unconscious, and we have to learn how to constellate it, to bring it up into our regular life. Now, what the religions did was they developed systems over thousands of years to constellate these ideas, these numinous things that actually do happen. And just see if I have it handy. We have to understand that for each of us, just looking for another picture to explain what I'm talking about here. It's in a different place, but numerous things do happen to us, and we can't explain them. So it's very rare to get these things um, on film of any kind or on a photograph, but it so happens that a few of them have happened to me in in times that um, I had a camera handy, and so they allowed me to see what a numinous thing is. And so this is one incident that occurred to me at the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel, where I was sort of in a trauma at the time. I was very depressed. And suddenly, the chapel was dark. It was on a morning, and there was no one else in the chapel. It was quite dark. There were no lights on, only the windows. And so I was sitting in a pew, and all of a sudden, this light came on me, and it came on only me and nowhere else in the chapel. And so the result was that this is what I saw, and it changed my attitude instantly. It was just, whoo, wow, that's amazing. And then I thought, well, nobody's going to believe me about this unless I take a picture of it. So I pulled out my camera and I took a picture of it. And as you see, it's quite dark in the chapel in this image. And yet there is light coming down on me. And the other image that goes with this one, I'll just pull that one up too. I turned around and I turned the camera around on myself and took this selfie. And again, you can see that only the light was only on me, and it wasn't anywhere else in the chapel. So the chapel's quite dark, and these are stained glass windows. So it shows what a dark day it actually was. And yet, because you can't see the stained glass very well. And so the point was that this incident for me was particularly numinous, and it totally changed my attitude on that day from one of depression to one of almost euphoria that, you know, God, whatever that is, had seen fit to shine a light particularly on me and changed my attitude to life. Now, I don't say that was a giant puppeteer up in the sky. It was actually a readiness in my psyche, which had been depressed, to see some change in the atmosphere that would give me hope for the future. And so you can see why I would think that on that particular day, when that vision came to me, it changed my attitude, made me happier. And so that's the kind of spiritual awakening, the kind of numinous awakening that one gets. Sorry, I'm just trying to set up my desktop properly. Okay. So Tacey goes on, secularism had not taken the unconscious into account. And so in that particular case that I was just showing you, the unconscious, I was depressed, and but my unconscious was ready to find a change in my attitude. And so when that event of the sunlight shining only on me happened, my unconscious reacted to that, and it was quite an amazing experience for me. And I don't claim it would be an amazing experience for you. You have to get your own amazing experiences. But I know that these things happen to me every day. There are things like you're pulling your car out of your parking place, and all of a sudden someone swerves around you but doesn't hit you, and they blow their horn, but you go, phew, thank goodness they missed me. Well, that's a numinous experience too. It's not on the magnitude of light shining on you in a chapel, but that's sort of the hand of God protecting you from having an auto accident. And so this is the sort of thing that happens, and you just have to you have to learn to experience these things and recognize them for what they are. But now, because I'm quite skilled at this, I see numinosity occurring all the time. So secularism had not taken the unconscious into account. There was unlived life that would blow secularism to smithereens. Secularists assumed that if religion could be denounced, and if science could show that its assertions were wrong, religion would disappear and never return. However, the religious urge is ineradicable. It can't be erased. And to the degree that we repress it, the danger increases. So if you repress your spiritual needs, they're going to come back and get you. And there's a couple of lines from Goethe's Faust that are amusing, where the character called the Proctophantasmist, and most of you know what a proctologist is, but anyway, the Proctophantasmist, who is a devilish creature, says, "Are you still here? Nay, it's a thing unheard." We've said the enlightening word, and so the point of the speech is that the religious function is still present, and even though they've talked it out of the system by proving that it doesn't exist in the physical world, nevertheless, it does exist. So, so it's ineradicable. It's not, you can't erase it. So today we witness the rise of fundamentalism in all the religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and in Hinduism and even Buddhism. We live in a world in which religion and violence have become permanently associated, which is a shocking irony given that the scriptures of all religions preach love and peace. So the point is that religion has come back to explain the fact that we have these numinous experiences all the time. But unfortunately, they've caused these conflicts around the world, especially throughout my lifetime, going back to things like the religious riots in India that were causing Mohandas Gandhi to fast to try to stop those events. If you see the movie Gandhi, you can see depictions of that. And so he would try to stop them from fighting by fasting to death, himself to death almost. And then when he was almost dead, and this happened 2 or 3 times, then the rioting would stop. And why would it stop? Probably because the women finally got through to the men who were knuckleheads. So We, we live in a world in which religion and violence have become permanently associated, which is a shocking irony given that the scriptures of all religions preach love and peace. But once the spirit is defiled, it emerges in distorted forms and nothing other than a change in attitude, a new reckoning or covenant will alter its destructive course. So we see that this in the making of Donald Trump almost to be a religious figure, and nothing is going to stop that until his followers see the light that they've been misled down a rabbit hole. But until that happens, he will be seen as a messiah by some. He's a pretty poor messiah, but nonetheless, he's managed to capture a lot of people. Okay, Christopher Koch wrote, "The spirit doesn't die, of course, it turns into a monster. Fragments of the sacred are found in the distorted religious forums of today, and the perpetrators of terror quote passages of scripture as they fly planes into the World Trade Center or attack railways, buses, hotels, concerts, and media outlets, or the U.S. Capitol, I would add. This wrath is not entirely of political origin, but has its source in an archetypal disposition." And we've talked about what that archetypal disposition is. Basically, it's a very intense resentment that people have. And that's the source of archetypal terrorism. And it isn't that the people who attack the Capitol are wrong in their resentment. I too have resentment, but I don't choose to try to resolve my problems by attacking a marble building, which isn't going to be destroyed. I mean, any more than the Cathedral of Notre Dame was destroyed when it burned. And good morning, Yuan. I didn't acknowledge your arrival, so I just wanted you to know that I do see you there, and thank you for coming this morning, this evening. That is why the war on terror can never eradicate this violence, because we are not only talking about human carriers of evil, but a predisposition to evil in the psyche itself. So the point is that when you have a war, you think, well, you can kill these people, and once they're gone, it will stop. But that's not true. And what happens is the predisposition of evil comes up in each one of us in some way. And until we are individuated sufficient to understand that it's really within us, it's not those bad people over there, it's in here. And we have to fix that first. Only then will we get resolution. And so at the moment, we're only gradually getting this idea out into the world. Jung worked with a very, very close cadre of friends for like 40 years. There were only 25 or 30 people around him. So no one else knew this. No one else understood this psychological function. And so now we're broadcasting across the world, and people can start to understand it and start to talk with other people about it, because the happiness and the end of this urge to violence only comes from within each one of us, and we have to start there and then work outward. But even if we kill everybody that doesn't agree with us, we're going to find ourselves pretty lonely people in the long term. And we understand how wonderful that is after a year of COVID. Um, so the predisposition to evil is in the psyche itself. It's not in those people over there. Um, but it is not as if terrorists are targeting only not non-religious or anti-religious people. And an irrational process has been unleashed and lashes out in any direction, often against other Islamic traditions. So his point here, he was writing shortly after 9/11, and the point is that if you start an irrational process, it may come back and eat you. And in fact, we're seeing that now in the American Republican Party and among these groups, because these groups like the Proud Boys and the Faith Keepers, Oath Keepers, and those people, they start looking inwardly at their own group, trying to understand who the traitor is, um, because some of their members are getting arrested and prosecuted for what happened at the Capitol. And so they don't understand that it's their own problem within their own group. Um, And so he goes on. So the point is that in Islam, once 9/11 happened, a lot of Muslims started to blame one another instead of um, seeing that it's themselves that's the problem. And by the same token, um, Americans will blame Muslims for many of our problems, and that isn't fair either. and and so what we have to understand is, well, let's take, for example, the immigration issue in the United States, which is particularly uh, a big issue across the southern United States, because we have many tens of thousands of people trying to come into the U.S. all the time. And um, and so how do we stop that? Well, our former president's idea was to build a wall, but a wall doesn't work for a variety of reasons, among which you can dig under it, you can fly over it, and um, and so it's a fixed fortification that doesn't work. And what you have to do is stop the conditions that um, make coming here attractive. And so he attempted to do that by being inhumane to the people who were coming here during his presidency, by separating families at the border and that sort of thing. And that didn't stop anybody. or maybe it slowed it down a little bit, but people still came, and they're still waiting to come into the US. And oh, by the way, we need those people, because as the US gets larger in population and so on, we do need people who will take on any job in order to build up their family, uh, who are living in abject poverty. So they, uh, their governments also are dysfunctional, and so they come here thinking that at least they can get some um, very low paying job, um, and then build up their family's life for the future. And so even in a time of Trump, uh, we still have people from all over the world wanting to come to this country, and we need them. Okay. And it's an unfortunate fact that many companies will use undocumented people to do our gardening work, for example, or to do babysitting work, things like that. People who are willing to work for below the minimum wage and off the books. And, it's an unfortunate fact, but that's how the system works. So when we go on about minimum wage, that minimum wage isn't even touching those people that are willing to come and work doing anything in order to improve the conditions for their family. And so so those are unfortunate facts, but nonetheless true, and everybody knows that it's true. And we wouldn't the people that are wealthy in the U.S., people like the guy who owns that motor yacht Never Enough, he wouldn't get his lawn mowed, but for the fact that we have people who want to come here and work in menial labor. And so their spirit is forcing them to come here because it's easier and safer than living in their own countries. And that's understandable. And we need those people. And eventually, some of their descendants rise to high office. I mean, we're having those results right now. For example, the Vice President of the United States, her parents came from Dominican Republic, I think, and from India. And so she's a first generation American. She was born in the United States and therefore is a native born American. But it was the attitudes and work ethic of her parents, her immigrant parents, which made it possible for her to become vice president of the United States. Imagine that, in one generation. And that's why people are trying to come here, because they know in their own societies that can't happen, because many times their government in their own countries are authoritarian governments. They're like mafia gangs, and so there's no way up there. And of course, we have this problem in low income communities also, where young men, for example, have no way to up, and so they resort to being gang members instead. That's their way to improve their life in the U.S. And unfortunately, that has very negative results all over the country. And until we solve poverty, and we're going to have that kind of violence. And so the answer to building a wall is simply use that amount of money instead to help the Guatemalans, for example, or the Haitians, or whoever, the Mexicans, whoever it is that wants to come to the U.S. What we should be doing is making it easier for their countries to succeed and to build up jobs in their home country. And then they won't be wanting to come to the U.S. But until we understand that the secret is not building a wall, but building successful countries around the world, we're going to continue to have these problems. So let's see, going on. Okay, there is a disturbance in the world psyche, and it will do a great deal of damage to all civilizations. And of course, we're seeing that around the world. The message for us is that the religious life has become pathological. In other words, the way trying to cookie cutter our spiritual needs into a system that served humanity for the last 2,000 years, let's say, but is no longer serving humanity. We can't get, we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. In other words, Humpty Dumpty was an egg that sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and he broke into a thousand pieces, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. Well, we're not going to put the modern world back together again in postmodern times. In postmodern times, we have people. In modern times, we had sort of strict boundaries around the world. And so it was very clear cut if you were an Italian, let's say, or a Frenchman, and everybody knew where you belonged and that sort of thing. But today, all those boundaries have been erased. If you're in Western Europe, it used to be before COVID that you could drive from Rome to Copenhagen without crossing a border checkpoint. And so once those barriers came down, you can't put them back up again. People are European now. And yes, there's still remnants of the nationalities in various places, but we have those still in the United States as well. And so you can tell them by the accent that people speak today. In Europe, they're still speaking different languages, typically Romance languages, French, Italian, and Spanish. And those are different languages, but they all have the same roots. And so, but those differences are going away. So, for example, even with English, when I was first going to India, because the British had dominated India for 250 years, if you spoke to an Indian in English, they would sound like a Britisher. They would speak English like a Britisher. But over the last 30 years since I've been going to India and working in India, that's changed completely because on the internet, American English is dominant. And so therefore, people who are learning English from listening to YouTube videos are going to tend to speak like Americans, not like Britishers. And so when I speak to my colleagues overseas today, if they're speaking to me in English, then it's very clear to me that they're changing to American English. And so these changes happen in society and in the world all the time. And so going on, militant Islamic groups are burdened with the task of reminding the West, which they refer to us as infidel, of the dangers of the sacred. And so, okay, all fundamentalism is teaching us those lessons, as most of the people who follow me in this group know. I've had Christianity used as a weapon against me, and and so now I know to respect the sacred, whereas before maybe I didn't respect it enough. So this reality cannot be trifled with. Let me see how long this is going here. I have still 4.5 pages, so I'm going to keep going. This reality cannot be trifled with, and analyzing the post-secular condition is an urgent priority. Extremist groups or cells of violence are opposed to modernization and its consequences. It is not so much the West that these groups are opposing, but the field of modernity. Discernment is required. Islam is not Islamism, and we should never forget it, but the latter operates in the name of the former. Militant groups operate in the name of religions, but are to be differentiated from them. A commentator says, when I use the phrase religious violence, I do not mean violence caused by religion, but violence associated with it. We are witnessing a mutant religiousness that has more to do with violence than with worship. So, in other words, in the U.S., it's a very common joke to talk about, the very masculinized Jesus who wears a pistol on his hip and is a very violent, virulent man instead of the peace-loving Jesus of the New Testament. And so it isn't Jesus that is the problem. The problem is that we've weaponized Christianity. And so as many of you know, one of my daughters told me on her 22nd birthday that I was going to hell. And it took me, and she was right, okay, because in that moment I fell into hell, a kind of hell on earth, where I thought my daughter thought such a thing about me. And it took at least 10 years for me to work my way out of it. And it's the reason I studied Jungian psychology so much, because in my study of Jungian psychology, I found my way out of that hell. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing today. That's why you're listening to this broadcast, because I found it so helpful that I'm trying to share it with others in the world. So extremist groups, let's see. So we are witnessing a mutant religiousness that has more to do with violence than with worship. And so things change, evolve all the time, or we can say they mutate, as we see the coronavirus mutating around the world. And so some versions of it are worse than others. And so we need to go back and understand what these versions mean and whether we can control them or not. And so we're just now getting vaccines for the original versions of COVID. And so yesterday I was lucky because of my age to get the second shot. And so theoretically I would be immune, but because of the mutations coming around, I might not be because of the mutations. And so we have the same thing basically going on in weaponizing religions. Okay. However, the separation between Islam and terrorism can be taken too far. Some Islamic leaders deny that Islam is in any way involved in these atrocities. They claim that Islam is a peaceful religion concerned with justice and truth. In his work Defending Islam, the name of the work is The Secret of Islam, Love and Law in the Religion of Ethics. Henry Bayman writes, the drastic departure from what has been the Islamic norm for 14 centuries can only be explained by a lack of or distortion, not an excess of Islamic sensibility. So he's saying that the militant Islam that we're seeing in the world today, to the extent it still exists, is really a distortion of Islam. And I agree with that, having personally lived and worked in 12 Muslim countries. I know that those societies are by and large peaceful societies. And so again, the mutations of Islam where it's been weaponized is the problem, not Islam. So he goes on, quote, suicide attacks are not just un-Islamic, they are profoundly anti-Islamic. Historically, they had no place at all in Islamic culture. Suicide bombing was invented by other parties and began to be used by so-called Muslims only during the last few decades. Its use in the Middle East is due not to a religious, but to a political dispute, unquote. So, as we see, these violent methods are used in political control. They're not used in religions, whether it's Donald Trump or anything else. Other apologists blatantly deny that terrorism is an Islamic problem and say it is instead a human problem. I take their point, but am not convinced. I don't think plain denial is helpful. So I agree with that. I'm just denying that it's this or that isn't the answer. We have to fully understand that we're part of the problem, each one of us. And, but for the grace of God, go I. That applies to my fellow Americans who attacked the Capitol. While I would never do that in my own mind, I think, nonetheless, I carry the same burden of resentment as many of those people do. And so do many Americans who have, over the last 12, 13 years, had their life savings harvested by people who don't care about the rest of us. And by that, I mean acquisitive investment bankers and Wall Street that create bubbles in the economy that once those bubbles burst, it destroys the rest of us. They're fine because they control the power to change things and to get money, just free money given to them, which is what happened in 2008. So when the bubble collapsed, they got the federal government to pay off all home mortgages, for example, in a $450 billion bailout. And so they were not out any money, but nonetheless, they used their control of power to then go foreclose on 10 million American families and take their homes, which happened to me. And so the difference between most of those people and me is I fought them for 9 years. And as a result of that fact, and because I'm an attorney, I was able to do that. I put about $2 million worth of legal time into fighting my lawsuit. And as a result of that fact, I found the truth of what they had done. And so what happened was they got themselves paid double on all defaulted mortgages. And that is unconscionable in my belief. And I resent it. But that doesn't mean that I would attack the Capitol about it, because actually the people in the work in the Capitol aren't the ones that are doing that. It's the people that work on Wall Street that did it. And, when the right direction for this wrath was represented by the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, not by the people who attacked the Capitol in 2021. And so I suspect that this wrath, this resentment, is going to get redirected back toward the people who have done this. And make no mistake about it, they've twisted people's minds in such a way that the people who want to commit violence are actually the people that they have intentionally caused to be resentful. So we have to start rethinking a lot of this. So anyway, other apologists blatantly deny that terrorism is an Islamic problem and say it is instead a human problem. I take their point, but I'm not convinced. I don't think plain denial is helpful, and I agree entirely with that. We have to find better ways. And contrary to those who wish to make a definite division between terrorism and Islam, Wolfgang Giegerich of Berlin writes, quote, "Many Islam scholars and many well-meaning people in the West warn against confusing the acts and ideology of the Islamic terrorist with Islam as such. True Islam, they claim, is a peaceful religion, and the jihad, they point out, actually has a strictly religious meaning, very different from that found in the terrorist use of the term. As justified as this caution is academically, it is also irrelevant in the concrete situation we are in. What the terrorists do reflects on Islam as such, maybe indeed not on true, authentic, original Islam as it should be understood, but certainly on real Islam." So yes, people do things in the name of patriotism in the United States. For example, they carried American flags. They all thought that they were patriotic Americans who were attacking the Capitol. But, no, no kind of patriotism I know would cause us to attack our government. And, I've taken the oath of office to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I've taken that oath 7 times in my Marine Corps career, and I believe in that oath more than anything. I wrote a check up to and including my own life when I joined the Marine Corps, and I was willing to bet my life on the value of the Constitution of the United States. And 5 men that I personally knew or know did give their lives for that. And so I'm very committed to that. And, that's real patriotism. But people who think that violence is the way, the answer is to be effective politically. And how does that change? So Giegerich confronts the political correctness of our time and its inability to face facts. To offer any critique of Islam in our time is dismissed as Islamophobia. My view is that militant Islamism is a traumatized version of Islam. This is a dark side of Islam that has to be integrated. every religious culture has to admit to its shadow side and not bury it beneath a spousal of goodness and piety. Psychiatrist Henry Crystal says trauma produces a regression in effect, a deficit in the capacity of symbolic representation, and increase in fantasy formation. So we see that many of these proud boys and oath keepers have this fantasy that Donald Trump is going to be a messianic leader and that their life will be better. Well, did their life get better actually since Donald Trump took office? No, probably not. But they have a regressive fantasy that it did or could, and that's not true. And as they are about to see, many of them are going to spend years in prison because of what they did on January the 6th. And that doesn't make them bad Americans per se, because I understand their resentment. But what they need to do is understand that there are other ways to make change, and violence isn't one of them. There is a deficit of symbolic awareness and fantasy formation in the terrorists, many of whom are inspired by the idea of unreal rewards in heaven. So the people that attacked the Capitol presumably think that there ultimately will be rewards that are their rewards for doing this. But I see no sign of that, because Donald Trump has never cared about anyone except himself. He has, maybe his daughter Ivanka, but I haven't seen him care about the American people. And so that inspiration is just a mistake. And we have to help people understand that. And so, I'm sure the man who brought bear spray to the Capitol just thought it was a funny idea. Well, it's not as bad as tear gas, so I can use this to control the situation around me. But what he apparently didn't know is that Officer Sicknick was susceptible to bear spray and allergic to it. And as I understand it, the coroner now thinks that Officer Sicknick died from the bear spray. And so that feeds into what's called the eggshell skull rule under American law, under American jurisprudence. They teach the eggshell skull rule in law school. And what it means is that that you are responsible for the susceptibility of your victim. And so if you just tap somebody on the head, as you might to get their attention, if they're a child, you tap them a couple of times on the head to get their attention, maybe. But instead of, just wailing against them and spanking them hard, which a lot of people would do, and which my own father and mother used to do until I stopped them. But if you tap on a baby's head and that baby has an eggshell skull, so it causes the skull to fracture just by tapping on it. It's nothing for most of us, but an eggshell skull will break and be destroyed. Then you're responsible for that. And so the guy who thought it was funny and fun to bring bear spray because it'll stop the Capitol Police, but it's not as bad as tear gas, didn't anticipate that Officer Sicknick would be susceptible to bear spray and therefore die from it. And so that individual is going to, unfortunately, he ran into the wrong part of the law in his experience. And what I would expect is that he'll be found guilty of murder. It might be second-degree murder because he wasn't necessarily intending to kill Officer Sicknick, perhaps, but nonetheless, he did kill him, and he was intending to use the bear spray. So, and therefore, he probably will spend a long time in prison, is what I guess. And we have to prosecute people like that in order for the rest of society to get the message, to learn the lesson that you can't do things like that and expect the rest of us to agree to it. So the Ku Klux Klan does not represent Christianity. However, it cannot be fully separated from it either. It represents the evil, demonic face of this culture. The first rule of psychology is not to disavow darkness when it appears. This thing of darkness I not acknowledge mine, said Shakespeare in The Tempest. So when we have an eruption of the dark side of our own psychology, as we had on January the 6th, we can't disavow it and say, oh, I would never do that. Yes, maybe I would at some point do that if things were bad enough or my family were attacked in some way. But most of the time I wouldn't. And so we have to first understand that we have evil within ourselves and then figure out what we have to do with it. So with a few exceptions, perhaps 5% of that crowd on January the 6th, I don't think there was evil intent there. I think that they were just very patriotic Americans, actually patriotic, or thought they were, who got misled by an evil crew. And so, anyone can be picked up by that, okay? And so, for example, in my community, we have people who own an ice cream business where you go up to the window and they have wonderful flavors of ice cream. And my family has always loved that business. But on January the 6th, the owner of that business had chartered 4 buses to drive from Annapolis, Maryland over to the Capitol to participate in that demonstration. And knowing my neighbors as I do, I can't imagine that there were many, if any, of the people in those buses who thought that they were going to attack the Capitol, commit vandalism, and possibly hang the Vice President of the United States. I doubt if that was in any of their minds. And yet, when you allow yourself to get swept up into a crowd like that, that very well can happen, and it can be led by a very small group of people. So, Jung was famous for the quote that 100 admirable people in a room add up to one blockhead. And what he meant by that is that if Donald Trump just goes out and makes statement after statement, and a few people around him say, okay, yeah, I agree, and then the next week he has a slightly bigger crowd and everybody's going, then over time, as we saw, he can create quite a large entourage of people that are not disputing anything he says, and that's a psychic epidemic. We saw it happen in Germany in the 20th century, and the end of it, it couldn't stop until all the crockery was broken in Western Europe, and so it's not easy to stop, and we have to wake up from it first, and wake up from the people who are following Donald Trump without question need to step back and understand what the true world is like. So anyway, going on with this essay, Gingrich has argued that the wave of terrorist violence is not a class struggle between rich and poor, nor is it a battle between Islam and Christianity. Rather, it is a battle between a modern and a medieval mindset. And so what Jung had said during his lifetime is, if you're walking down the street, there can be a range of attitude and psychological development in the people that you meet that can be approximately 10,000 years worth. And what that means is that there can be some people that you run into on the street who have a mindset equal to a barbarian, and there can be others who are quite refined individuals with higher education, multiple degrees, and that sort of thing. And they all look more or less the same, but the psyche in those people is quite different. And so we have to be conscious of that. We have to be conscious of the fact that the people that we run into may not be as educated or as logical as we are, and they might see that popping you over the head is the way to get what they want. Obviously, we see this in crime all the time, where people steal a car or a boat, let's say, and they think if they just grab your boat or your car, then they can have what they need and want. But the reality is that very often they get caught and they get put into jail, and they just haven't grown up. And so what we have to learn and develop is prisons where people learn to grow up and not have antisocial behavior like that. Okay, so the West has had a long battle with its traditional religious system, so that the natural tendency of any religion to see itself as superior to others has been fought and won. That is what makes the West modern, a long historical and philosophical critique of its religious system, in which theological hegemony, that's control, in which theological control was destroyed and individual rights emerged as a powerful moral force. An equivalent development did not take place in the Islamic world. The crucial fight with, indeed against itself and its own orthodoxy has not taken place. And so we're not out of the woods yet. We're doing this, and we're saying that there's aspects of our all of our religions that is not good, and it's the weaponization of the original religions. And so we are, by most of the time, having the right freedom of speech. We can show the shortcomings of our various religions, and gradually that resolves itself. But unfortunately, the way we are going about it is still quite limited. For example, all the religious leaders in a community do know this, and they know that what they have to do is to get their parishioners to work together. And so they have a nice lunch, let's say, once a month, in which they get together and talk about common problems. But the problem with what they do is that they then go back to their denomination uh, and continue to educate people in the idea that only their denomination is right and all the others are not right. And that's not true. Okay, they're all right, and um, they're all different but correct in terms of what they are doing for psychological development of the parishioners. So, um, the point of religion is that it has always been a way of psychological development. And so let me go to one of my go-to quotes here so that we see what I'm talking about here. So I gave a talk in October of 2019 called Finding the Living God. And I urge you to find that um, talk on this YouTube channel, because I spoke about it for an hour and a half. But I'll show you the key important um, point in that, key important slide in that talk, which is this. Theologians and psychologists are in the same business. For thousands of years, the mind of man was worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul, and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are naturally evolved psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. And so Dr. Jung said this in volume 10 of his collected works called Civilization in Transition, paragraph 367. And it's important to understand that theologians and psychologists are in the same business. And if we understand that, then we can see that the value of our religions has always been to help us work through various things that happen in life. And I often pull up my little red ball, um, which represents chaos. And we all face chaos in our lives, and much more so than our ancestors do, because we have had an exponential growth in information and knowledge in our society. So, the statistic was that a person of the 16th century only received as much information in a lifetime as we receive in the Sunday New York Times, one edition. And so just imagine that you go and buy the major newspaper in your city, and you see how much information is there, and that amount of information is equal to the total amount of information that somebody would get in an entire lifetime, and yet we get it weekly. And so, things are even way worse than that now, in that we have opened up the internet since 1995, the last 25 years. So now we have available to us all the information of the world, except for government secrets and corporate secrets per se. And so the result of that is that it's natural for people to be confused because there's so much information, and what should we do about it? But the secret is that we have to learn as individuals to step out of the chaos. And my wife gave me this little, can't see what I'm showing you here, this little bracelet for Christmas, and it's a dragon. And so I wear this dragon on my right arm. It doesn't matter which arm I wear it on, but it's a symbol of the Ouroboros, which is the dragon that circles the earth and eats its own tail. And so when I put it on, as you see, it's eating its own tail. And what that means is that the chaos of the universe that all of us face, is chaotic, and we have to be able to step back from the chaos and select the things that are important in our lives and use those. And so, what you see, what we saw on January 6th was certainly chaotic, and it was an eruption of the chaotic psyches of many Americans. But we have to now step back from that and see what it is about those experiences that is useful and what we can do with that information. And that's true of everything. So the reason religious ceremony in any religion is good is because it gives us an opportunity to step back and reflect on the chaos that we face and to move forward step by step. And so, and see how we can make things happen. And so I see opportunity in the chaos all the time. An example would be last week we did a session with Dr. Saad Goshen on the art group that he has worked on since 2002. So he's a epidemiologist that works in his career was in Cincinnati, Ohio as a physician, but he found that he could help with ideas of peace by helping people become artists. And so he's done quite a wonderful job on that. I urge you to go back and take a look at that video. It's about SOS, which is Save Our Souls Art Cincinnati. And you'll find it in the most recent videos on this YouTube channel. But as I was listening to Dr. Goshen speak about it, he mentioned that he's an epidemiologist and that he has relationships with Lebanon, which was his country of origin. And so for me, it so happens that I'm working on solving pandemic response. In other words, a company that I have worked with for 30 years in one way or another suddenly is developing a solution to pandemic response. And so here that company is overseas, but I'm sitting here in Maryland, U.S., and now I know a doctor who has connections into Lebanon, who happens to be an expert in epidemiology. And so I can take the information from my company outside the US. It comes through my psyche, and then it can go back out to Lebanon. And so in terms, I think of the 6 degrees of separation that everybody should know about, which is that you can reach anyone in the world by going through 6 steps, 6 hops. And so the basic idea of it is I know somebody, and that person knows somebody else, and that person knows somebody else. And if you do that for 6 steps, 6 times, you'll be able to reach anybody in the world. And so, that's certainly true of me in my lifetime, because, now I know Dr. Goshen, and we have a friendly relationship now. And so now, if I want to take my business ideas about pandemic response to Lebanon, who would have thought it? I simply can call up my friend Saad Goshen, and in one hop, I can get to the attention of government officials that are interested in epidemiology in Lebanon, and so that's one hop, and it gives you an example of the idea of 6 degrees of separation. We're only 6 hops away from anybody in the world we need to meet on any topic. And so I've used that concept throughout my career, and it served me quite well. So, for example, I can reach the Prime Minister of India in one hop, and many other senior officials in India. It doesn't mean that I would do that willy-nilly, but if I had a good reason to communicate with the Prime Minister of India, I might be able to, or I might at least be able to get my ideas through to that person. And, typically, this session on Sunday mornings is at 8 a.m., so there are not many Americans that are involved in the conversation at 8 o'clock in the morning, and fewer that are west of me. I'm in the eastern United States. So for people in California, I start this program at 5 a.m. So I don't expect many Americans to be listening to this program, especially not at the beginning. And so the result is that I presume that most of the people on YouTube that are watching this now in live stream are people who live outside the United States. Maybe many of them are in Western Europe, many who don't speak English as a first language. And, I happen to know that I have somebody in Asia that's listening and participating right now. And so I can reach all those places just by knowing those people and by communicating my ideas. So my ideas can pass from me to that person and then off into their country very easily. And this is why I do it. But also, now that I've talked about pandemic response, I wouldn't be surprised at all if people start to write to me and say, well, we need better pandemic response in my country. And of course, we need it in my country too, because all of us are suffering from COVID this year. And so I'm pushing my colleagues who are working on the software for this to finish their project as soon as possible so that I can then present it to people around the world, which I will do. That will happen sometime between April and June, I suppose, of this year. So stay tuned. But in any case, what I know just from this little example is because I did a community session with Dr. Goshen about art a week ago, I now know that I can reach the right people in Lebanon and in other countries as well. And so it's just phenomenal what power the internet gives us to reach out across the world. And I've always been able to use that facility very effectively in my career. And I hope all of you do as well. Okay, so now moving on. So an equivalent development did not take place in the Islamic world. Okay, so in other words, Islam still is very much as it was in medieval times and hasn't been challenged, and therefore hasn't evolved beyond its original form. And whereas at least in Protestant Christianity, there are now 400 different sects of Protestant Christianity. So there's a lot of evolution going on. And what we have to do is persuade our theologians that instead of just having a nice lunch with one another every month, and then going back and teaching their religious doctrine in the same old way, they need to understand what's good about all the doctrines and start to adopt the good things. The simple example I give is prayer 5 times a day, because in Islam, that's the custom to pray 5 times a day. And I say, what could be wrong with that? Because that's how we get out of the chaos, right? That's how you control the chaos, is you step back from your life for a few minutes. And through prayer, you can reflect on what's going on your life, and then come back and do a better job. 15 minutes later, if you do that. So what could be bad about that? Nothing. And yet we don't find other religions trying to adopt that. We should, because it's good. Okay, so anyway, the critical fight with, indeed, against itself and its own orthodoxy has not taken place. As a result, we find pre-modern features still in place: the prevalence of the ancient emotions of shame and honor in a culture in which human rights are submerged. Shame and honor are more important than individual lives, which is why lives can be sacrificed so readily. The greatest sin is not to take lives, but to criticize the sanctified claims of the Islamic religious system. Okay, so fair enough. This was expressed in the fatwa against novelist Salman Rushdie. In 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa ordering Muslims to kill Rushdie for supposed blasphemy in the Satanic verses. Khomeini's fatwa was condemned across the Western world by governments on the grounds that it violated the rights of free speech and freedom of thought. However, human rights were not accepted as a basis for justice in Iran. The issue was said to have divided Muslims from Westerners along the fault line of culture. Said the Ayatollah in 1990, even if Rushdie repents and becomes the most pious man of all time, it is incumbent on every Muslim to employ everything he has got, his life and wealth, to send him to hell. I'm sure Salman Rushdie feels that he has been in hell since 1989. The problem behind Islamic terrorism is the conflict between two different historical stages of cultural development. Okay, and so just as Salman Rushdie was condemned by the Ayatollah, I was condemned by my daughter. However, in my case, I did not blame it on my daughter, my birth daughter, but I blamed it on the people that taught my daughter. So I said, who teaches a child to say such a thing to a parent? That's ridiculous. And so I didn't blame my daughter for it, but as Anne Belford Ulanoff has said in her books, you can fall for the devil's trick, and the devil's trick would be for me to blame my daughter and cut off all relations with her and be quite angry with her and have constant fights with her over religion. And that's not what I did and not what I would ever do. And so, we have to get to the bottom of who would weaponize a religion to separate children from their parents, who weaponizes a religion to control people's thinking. That's the question. And that's the devil's trick. If you use things like religion as a weapon against people, then it becomes quite troublesome. The good news is that even when that's done, over time, it dissipates. So if we look at the Soviet Union, the Russian Soviet Union, they did terrible things to their people over a 70-year period. And so the communist Russia, the Soviet Union, they used logic to persuade people to do the things that they wanted. And they used Marx's ideas of communism and socialism as a way to convince people that they were right. But of course, the more they used that idea, the more they forced people to do things, and the more violent they became against their own people. And in point of fact, they didn't succeed. And what they did was they created an oligarchy within their government anyway. So there's a book called The Red Tsar, which is about Stalin and the people around Stalin, and how basically Stalin behaved like all the czars of Russia ever did. And the result was, in Stalin's time, 20 million Russians were murdered. And it seems a stupid thing to do when they were also facing a war at the beginning of Stalin's time, and they lost 10 million Russians to the Germans. And it wasn't really the Russians that stopped the German army. It was Mother Nature in the form of the Russian winter, just the same as she had stopped Napoleon, many years before when Napoleon attacked into Russia, and his attacking army was simply decimated by the Russian winter. And so we need to understand the way these forces actually work. And so ultimately, what happened in Russia was that the Russian government, the Soviet government, ultimately collapsed. And they had used this logic, rationalism, to force religion out of the society in the same way that Mao Zedong had done in China, where he had said that religion is poison, and he tried to force religion out of China as well. And so in Russia, if you went to Russia in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, you wouldn't have been able to find a Christian church to attend, perhaps, because religion was forbidden in Soviet Russia. But when, as soon as the Russian government, the Soviet government, collapsed of its own weight, immediately the Russian people put all the cathedrals of Russia back together again. And so within 3 years, churches that had been forbidden to have religious services in them, including the one that's very famous on Red Square, suddenly were flourishing again. And the reason is because people have been practicing their religions, but they have been doing it secretly and privately. And so as soon as that repressive government was defeated by its own weight and by its own corruption, the people brought religion back immediately. And that's what this story is about, that you can't destroy the need for religious thinking. So let's see where I was here. So, however, human rights were not accepted as a basis for justice in Iran. The issue was said to have divided Muslims from Westerners along the fault lines of culture. Said the Ayatollah in 1990, even if Rushdie repents and becomes the most pious man of all time, it is incumbent on every Muslim to employ everything he has got, his life and wealth, to send him to hell. Well, I'm sure he was in hell for that, and maybe still is. Here we have an example of the medieval and the modern rubbing up against each other. The problem behind Islamic terrorism is the conflict between two different historical stages of cultural development. So I'm going to do one more paragraph, and then I'll leave the last 2 pages and a little more for next week. But it is the modern experiment that is viewed as decadent by Islam, since it has radically shaken the certainties of all religious systems. The modern has made the medieval mindset indignant and angry over the relativization of values, the annihilation of traditional structures, and the arbitrariness resulting from a free and open society. By way of defense, the medieval mindset turns against the modern and tries to destroy it. It is rage against the modern that we are witnessing. including anger at elements that make the medieval world feel insecure, such as the loss of male superiority and code of honor, the decline of patriarchy, the dissolution of fixed sexual roles, and the new freedoms given to women. All of this, together with the destabilization of religious authority, makes the medieval mind see modernity as decadent and perverse. What we find in the terrorist brotherhood is a masculine protest against a new world that the old world rejects. Okay, and so, yes, and we're seeing this throughout the world, and so there is a lot of change, no doubt, coming to the world, and so, you know, we see this erupt from time to time, even in the United States, where we do have an attitude of freedom and freedom of speech. And yes, of course, we have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean you can speak without consequence. And so that is the lesson that people are learning now, is that you can't just say negative things about other people and expect them to just accept it. You know, by the same token, given our January 6th attack, you can't attack our capital and expect us to just think it was a funny idea and everybody can go home and no harm, no foul. Well, there was harm. And for Officer Sicknick and for others, it was the end of their lives. So that's pretty substantial harm. And so the people that have done that are going to pay the price of making a mistake about what it is that we stand for in this country. And so, as I explained about the bear spray, you know, just because you think bear spray is harmless doesn't mean it is harmless. And it doesn't mean that the rest of us think it's harmless, and it doesn't mean that the rest of us want that in our society. And so we are going to express ourselves through our U.S. attorneys over the next year, let's say, and whoever had that silly idea that bear spray was harmless is going to find themselves convicted of murder or manslaughter or something, and is going to spend a very long time in prison as a result of that. And that will be a lesson to everybody else that the majority of us are not going to accept it, regardless of what political party we're members of. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up at this point, but I'm going to look at the comments here on the YouTube channel just before I wrap up so that we can be responsive. So Big Cat says that Joseph Campbell sensed that in Russia, Christianity would reemerge in the 21st century. And boy, was he ever right. And, you know, basically that's the lesson here, which is that, you know, you can come up with a very complex government, and, you know, if it doesn't work for your people, then it's going to fail. And that is what happened in the Soviet Union. And I just urge you to remember, if you're living in a country that is a repressive country, and there are many of those around the world, just remember Mohandas Gandhi's quote from the movie Gandhi. It's actually used in the movie Gandhi, where he says, throughout history, there have been tyrants, and for a time they seem very strong. But in the end, they always fail. Think of it, always. And so that is true if you look at history, that these things always collapse over time because the people ultimately will not stand for them. And so the question is, who is going to make the necessary sacrifices to make the changes that you want to live? And each one of us has to make our own decisions about that. And if enough people make those sacrifices, then change will come. And it always does eventually. And so the feudal system of Western Europe, for example, broke down, and we don't accept that there are some nobles that have rights over the average people. And even today in the U.S., if we look at our prison system, for example, at one point, someone came up with the terrible idea that prisons should be privately run for profit. And what that meant was that people who wanted to run prisons would give a lot of money to judicial candidates, judges, so that when they were in office, they would sentence people to long sentences, and therefore they would go to this for-profit prison, and they could use their labor in the prison at very low cost to support society. And it's been recognized as evil for many years by many of us. And President Biden, as soon as he was in office, within a week after taking office in January, he issued an executive order saying that at least at the federal government, we are not going to allow for-profit prisons anymore, because what it does is it takes some young person who makes a stupid small mistake, like selling a stick of marijuana, let's say, and puts them in jail for a long time, and it actually is harvesting their youth by putting them to work on projects for American industry, and at very low cost to American industry that wants to escape the minimum wage. And so what it became and is a form of modern slavery, where you capture people because they've committed some trivial offense and you put them in prison for years and years. And while they're there, you use their labor for industry. And that is a heinous idea. It still exists in many states. And it's something that we in the U.S. have to stamp out. And these things are constantly rearing their ugly heads in our country. And we have to constantly be vigilant to ideas like that emerging and preventing them from taking power over us. And so, as I said, now that President Biden is in power, we've stopped it, at least at the federal level, and it needs to be stopped in every state as well, because otherwise, what you have is a modern slavery, by different names, and that's horrific and not acceptable to me. And many of my fellow Americans. So anyway, thank you very much for being here today. I'm going to move on. And today at 2:30 p.m., or 2:15 p.m., which is 4 hours and 15 minutes from now, we will be having a live session again, a live stream. Let me see if I can find that book cover on my. I think I probably can. We're going to be talking about the absent father and what happens to daughters if the father is absent. And let's see. Well, I can't find it quickly enough, so I'm going to have to pass on that. But I was just going to show you the cover of this book. And I guess I can stop my cloaking for a moment so that I can show you this, because it's going to be an important presentation. So the book is The Absent Father Effect on Daughters, Father Desire and Father Wounds by Dr. Susan Schwartz. So Dr. Schwartz will be with us about 4 hours and 15 minutes from now to talk about her book. And I urge you to participate in that session if you can. Tammy, it's great to see you today. I hope you got your second shot or something. Hi, Annette. And I'm glad you liked the session. Big Cat says Margaret Atwood has a great novel about a private Midwestern American prison town. Half the town was in prison, the other half ran the prison, and then they would switch off every 6 months. Oh my God, I can imagine. Yeah, I remember the movie or the story about King Rat by James Clavell. It's a terrific book, by the way. And the funny thing was that the Japanese had taken over a prison, among other things, in Changi, Singapore. And what they did was the Japanese army moved into the prison, and they had the prisoners live in the countryside around the prison. And so at first I didn't understand that, but it made perfect sense because the Japanese wanted to live in the buildings, and they were making the prisoners live on the land. And there was no place to go because you couldn't escape Singapore by swimming away or going into the jungle. You would end up dead. And the thing that's amazing about that book is that it basically teaches you economics or microeconomics 101. So it's a very good way to learn economics. Read that book, King Rat by James Clavell, and you'll understand the way economics works. That's what I always thought it was, and a wonderful book. The movie isn't quite so good because it doesn't truly explain the economic aspects as well, but the book does. And so it's as with many of Clavell's novels, it's a wonderful novel, and I urge you to read it. And also, if you're a young person, I also recommend reading The Honorable Schoolboy by John le Carré. It's one of his first books, and it's a terrific book. Tammy asks, is it King Rat or King Wrath? No, this is King Rat, R-A-T, like the rodent. And King Rat is the name given to an individual in the book, but I wouldn't want to spoil it for you. You have to read it to understand it. So anyway, thank you all for being here, and I will see you in 4 hours or so. So peace.